Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the January 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Revolutionary Adventurism by Lenin from 1902. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or buy me a coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So this piece is quoted in the most recent audiobook that we put up on the channel, On Terrorism by Bill Bland, which was written in the 1970s when there was both some left adventurous terrorism as well as some false flag, actually right-wing but posing as left-wing terrorism going on in Europe. For more on that last point, we have a video on the channel here concerning Operation Gladio, which was the NATO code name for a network of, quote, stay-behind fascist operatives left over from World War II who were to be activated in the event of proletarian revolutions in Western Europe or a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, etc. However, instead of waiting to go on the defensive, they launched offensive operations which were then blamed on the left. So in Marxism, when we talk about adventurism as a term, what that means is action that is disconnected from the masses. While Marxists do believe that revolution and not reforms are the way that capitalism will be ended, which is not to say that reforms have no place, they just don't end capitalism, revolution is distinct from sort of random individual terrorism and other kinds of actions that are not part of mass struggle in the overall class struggle. So first you get a strong labor movement going and it gets more and more militant, and there are major strikes and political strikes, and eventually armed struggle breaks out. As an extension, in other words, of the previously existing class struggle, it just represents an escalation of that. Lenin laid out details for that process in a number of works, including one cited in On Terrorism. But overall, it involves a close relationship between the masses and the vanguard party. However, what happens sometimes is that groups of intellectuals or small conspiratorial would-be vanguard groups, either through a lack of skills or a lack of opportunity, are unable to connect their advice and their messages to the masses. And they're unable to get that relationship going, and they wind up just carrying out actions which are not, again, rooted in mass struggle. There are a lot of downsides to this. Lenin wrote many pieces warning against it, and it can be considered a kind of ultra-left or pseudo-left error. In other words, a left deviation, just as there are right deviations, which are more on the revisionist side, so the taking in of bourgeois ideas into the communist movement, or opportunist errors, which are more in the class collaboration or working with the bourgeoisie category. There's a lot written about revisionism and opportunism. For more about pseudo-left or ultra-left errors, you can see works like Lenin's, quote, left-wing communism and infantile disorder, and the left wing is in quotes because communism is left-wing, however these errors aren't, they are pseudo-left. Alright, with that as an introduction, let's get into the credits and then we'll start the text. So, this was first published in Iskra, The Spark, number 23, August 1st, and number 24, September 1st, 1902, published according to the Iskra text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1964, Moscow, Volume 6. The translator is unknown, HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala and D. Walters, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive. Marxists.org thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free texts. Let's begin. Section 1. We are living in stormy times, when Russia's history is marching on with 7-league strides, and every year sometimes signifies more than decades of tranquility. Comment, this was just a few years before the 1905 revolution. Continuing, results of the half-century of the post-reform period are being summed up, and the cornerstone is being laid for social and political edifices, which will determine the fate of the entire country for many, many years to come. The revolutionary movement continues to grow with amazing rapidity, and our trends are ripening and withering uncommonly fast. Trends firmly rooted in the class system of such a rapidly developing capitalist country as Russia almost immediately reach their own level and feel their way to the classes they are related to. An example is the evolution of Mr. Struve, from whom the revolutionary workers proposed to tear the mask of a Marxist only 1.5 years ago, and who has now himself come forward without this mask as the leader, or perhaps servant, of the liberal landlords, people who take pride in their earthiness and their sober judgment. On the other hand, trends expressing only the traditional instability of views held by the intermediate and indefinite sections of the intelligentsia try to substitute noisy declarations for rapprochement with definite classes, declarations which are all the noisier the louder the thunder of events. At least we make an infernal noise. Such is the slogan of many revolutionary-minded individuals who have been caught up in the maelstrom of events and who have neither theoretical principles nor social roots. It is to these noisy trends that the SRs, the socialist revolutionaries, whose physiognomy is emerging more and more clearly, also belong. Comment: the SRs, or socialist revolutionaries, were another party. Lenin was not fond of them. They were populist, somewhat in the Narodnik vein, representing parts of the peasantry. Continuing. And it is high time for the proletariat to have a better look at this physiognomy and form a clear idea of the real nature of these people, who seek the proletariat's friendship all the more persistently, the more palpable it becomes to them that they cannot exist as a separate trend without close ties with the truly revolutionary class of society. Comment: so basically the peasantry is a class which was dying out, and the proletariat was basically its future. In Marxism, of course, it's theorized that because capitalism has two great or significant classes, the bourgeoisie, which rules this era of society, and the proletariat, which is created in large numbers by this era of society, that the proletariat then is the revolutionary class, which will abolish this order at some point on the basis of their class interest, which is not in private property. Russia, at this point, in the early 1900s, lagging behind Europe, had a less developed capitalism than you would have found in England or France, etc., and so the proletarianization of the population was only partway done. Hence, the basis of the Russian Socialist Revolution and the construction of the USSR was a political alliance between the proletariat and the downwardly mobile peasantry, with the proletariat in the lead. A lot has been written about this topic, but if you're not familiar, there's a basic introduction. So, hence Lenin's statement about the peasantry not being able to exist as a separate trend without close ties to the proletariat, the truly revolutionary class. So, the peasantry in this sense would try to befriend the proletariat, but with which class's interest in the lead? The proletariats, as Marxists advocate, since the proletariat is, according to our understanding of historical development, the future and the basis, the ruling class in socialism, or the peasantries, which is basically a rural petty bourgeoisie. And this is basically the problem with the petty bourgeoisie. They neither have the money, like the big bourgeoisie has, nor the numbers, like the proletariat has, to get things done, and so they need friends. Continuing. 3 circumstances have served most to disclose the true face of the socialist revolutionaries. These are, first, the split between the revolutionary social democrats and the opportunists, who are raising their heads under the banner of the, quote, criticism of Marxism. Secondly, Balmashov's assassination of Sipyagin and the new swing towards terrorism in the sentiments of some revolutionaries. Thirdly, and mainly, the latest movement among the peasantry, which is compelled such that are accustomed to sit between 2 stools and have no program whatever to come out post factum with some semblance of a program. We shall proceed to examine these 3 circumstances with the reservation that in a newspaper article it is possible to give only a brief outline of the main points in the argument, and that we shall, in all likelihood, return to the subject and expound it in greater detail in a magazine article or in a pamphlet. Editor's note: although Lenin wrote elsewhere on this topic, that particular magazine article or pamphlet never surfaced. However, you can find notes and preliminary material under the title Extract from an Article Against the Socialist Revolutionaries, December 1902, also Outline of a Pamphlet Against the Socialist Revolutionaries, Spring 1903, and Outline of an Article Against the Socialist Revolutionaries, July 1903. Back to the text. It was only in number 2 of Vestnik Russkoye Revolutsii that the Socialist Revolutionaries finally decided to come out with a theoretical statement of principle in an unsigned editorial headed The World Progress and Crisis of Socialism. We strongly recommend this article to all who want to get a clear idea of utter unprincipledness and vacillation in matters of theory, as well as of the art of concealing this behind a spate of rhetoric. The entire content of this highly noteworthy article may be expressed in a few words. Socialism has grown into a world force. Socialism, meaning Marxism, is now splitting as a result of the War of the Revolutionaries, the, quote, orthodox against the opportunists, or the, quote, critics. We, socialist revolutionaries, quote, of course, have never sympathized with opportunism, but we are overjoyed because of the, quote, criticism, which has freed us from a dogma. We, too, are working for a revision of this dogma, and although we have as yet nothing at all to show by way of criticism, except for bourgeois opportunist criticism, although we have as yet revised absolutely nothing, it is nevertheless that freedom from theory which redounds to our credit. That redounds to our credit all the more because as people free themselves of theory, we stand firmly for general unity and vehemently condemn all theoretical disputes over principles. Paging BreadTube, quote, a serious revolutionary organization, Vestnik Ruskoi Revolucji assures us in all seriousness, quote, would give up trying to settle disputed questions of social theory, which always leads to disunity, although this, of course, should not hinder theoreticians from seeking their solution, unquote. Or, more outspokenly, let the writers do the writing and the readers do the reading, and in the meantime, while they're busying themselves, we will rejoice at the blank left behind. There is no need, of course, to engage in a serious analysis of this theory of deviation from socialism, in the events of disputes proper. In our opinion, the crisis of socialism makes it incumbent upon any in the least serious socialists to devote redoubled attention to theory, to adopt more resolutely a strictly definite stand, to draw a sharper line of demarcation between themselves and wavering and unreliable elements. In the opinion of the socialist revolutionaries, however, if such things as confusion and splits are possible, quote, even among Germans, then it is God's will that we Russians should pride ourselves on our ignorance of whither we are drifting. In our opinion, the absence of theory deprives a revolutionary trend of the right to existence, and inevitably condemns it, sooner or later, to political bankruptcy. In the opinion of the socialist revolutionaries, however, the absence of theory is a most excellent thing, most favorable, quote, for unity. As you see, we cannot reach agreement with them, for the fact of the matter is that we even speak different languages. There is one hope. Perhaps they will be made to see reason by Mr. Struve, who also, only more seriously, speaks about the elimination of dogma and says that, quote, our business, as is the business of any of the bourgeoisie who appeals to the proletariat, is not to disunite, but to unite. Will not the socialist revolutionaries ever see, with the help of Mr. Struve, what is really signified by their stand of liberation from socialism for the purpose of unity, and unity on the occasion of liberation from socialism? Let us go over to the second point, the question of terrorism. In their defense of terrorism, which the experience of the Russian revolutionary movement has so clearly proved to be ineffective, the socialist revolutionaries are talking themselves blue in the face in asseverating that they recognize terrorism only in conjunction with work among the masses, and that therefore the arguments used by the Russian Social Democrats to refute the efficacy of this method of struggle, and which have indeed been refuted for a long time to come, do not apply to them. Here something very similar to their attitude toward, quote, criticism is repeating itself. We are not opportunists, cry the socialist revolutionaries, and at the same time they are shelving the dogma of proletarian socialism, for reason of sheer opportunist criticism and no other. We are not repeating the terrorists' mistakes and are not diverting attention from work among the masses, the socialist revolutionaries assure us, and at the same time enthusiastically recommend to the party acts such as Balmashov's assassination of Sipiagin, although everyone knows and sees perfectly well that this act was in no way connected with the masses, and moreover, could not have been by reason of the very way in which it was carried out. That the persons who committed this terrorist act neither counted on nor hoped for any definite action or support on the part of the masses. In their naivete, the socialist revolutionaries do not realize that their predilection for terrorism is causally most intimately linked with the fact that from the very outset, they have always kept, and still keep, aloof from the working class movement, without even attempting to become a party of the revolutionary class, which is waging its class struggle. Over-ardent protestations very often lead one to doubt and suspect the worth of whatever it is that requires such strong seasoning. Do not these protestations weary them? I often think of the words, when I read assurances by the socialist revolutionaries, quote, by terrorism, we are not relegating work among the masses into the background, unquote. After all, these assurances come from the very people who have already drifted away from the social democratic labor movement, which really does rouse the masses. They come from people who are continuing to drift away from this movement, clutching at fragments of any kind of theory. The leaflet issued by the Party of the Socialist Revolutionaries on April 3, 1902, may serve as a splendid illustration of what has been stated above. It is a most realistic source, one that is very close to the immediate leaders, a most authentic source. The, quote, presentation of the question of terrorist struggle in this leaflet, quote, coincides in full, also, quote, with the party views, according to the valuable testimony of Revolutionная Russia. The April 3rd leaflet follows the pattern of the terrorists' quote, latest arguments with remarkable accuracy. The first thing that strikes the eye is the words, quote, we advocate terrorism not in place of work among the masses, but precisely for and simultaneously with that work, unquote. They strike the eye particularly because these words are printed in letters 3 times as large as the rest of the text, a device that is of course repeated by Revolutionная Russia. It is all really so simple. One has only to set not in place of but together with in bold type, and all the arguments of the Social Democrats, all that history has taught, will fall to the ground. But just read the whole leaflet and you will see that the protestation in bold type takes the name of the masses in vain. The day, quote, when the working people will emerge from the shadows, and, quote, the mighty popular wave will shatter the iron gates to smithereens. Quote, alas, literally, alas, is still a long way off, and it is frightful to think of the future toll of victims, unquote. Do not these words, alas, still a long way off, reflect an utter failure to understand the mass movement and a lack of faith in it? Is not this argument meant as a deliberate sneer at the fact that the working people are already beginning to rise? And finally, even if this trite argument were just as well founded as it is actually stuff and nonsense, what would emerge from it in particularly bold relief would be the inefficacy of terrorism, for without the working people, all bombs are powerless, patently powerless. Just listen to what follows, quote, every terrorist blow, as it were, takes away part of the strength of the autocracy, and transfers, somehow, all this strength to the side of the fighters for freedom, unquote. Quote, and if terrorism is practiced systematically, it is obvious that the scales of the balance will finally weigh down on our side, unquote. Yes, indeed, it is obvious to all that what we have here in its grossest form is one of the greatest prejudices of the terrorists. Political assassination of itself, quote, transfers strength. Thus, on the one hand, you have the theory of the transference of strength, and on the other, quote, not in place of, but together with. Do not these protestations weary them? But this is just the beginning. The real thing is yet to come. Quote, whom are we to strike down? Asks the Party of the Socialist Revolutionaries, and replies, the ministers, and not the Tsar, for, quote, the Tsar will not allow matters to go to extremes, unquote. How did they find that out? And besides, quote, it is also easier, this is literally what they say, quote, no minister can ensconce himself in a palace as in a fortress, unquote. And this argument concludes with the following piece of reasoning, which deserves to be immortalized as a model of the, quote, theory of the socialist revolutionaries. Quote, against the crowd, the autocracy has its soldiers. Against the revolutionary organizations, its secret and uniformed police. But what will save it? And parenthetically, what kind of it is this, the autocracy? The author has unwittingly identified the autocracy with a target in the person of a minister whom it is easier to strike down. Continuing the quote, from individuals or small groups that are ceaselessly, and even in ignorance of one another, preparing for attack and are attacking. No force will be of avail against elusiveness. Hence, our task is clear, to remove every one of the autocracy's brutal oppressors by the only means that has been left us by the autocracy, death, unquote. No matter how many reams of paper the socialist revolutionaries may fill with assurances that they are not relegating work among the masses into the background, or disorganizing it by their advocacy of terrorism, their spate of words cannot disprove the fact that the actual psychology of the modern terrorist is faithfully conveyed in the leaflet we have quoted. The theory of the transference of strength finds its natural complement in the theory of elusiveness, a theory which turns upside down not only all past experience, but all common sense as well. That the only, quote, hope of the revolution is the, quote, crowd. That only a revolutionary organization which leads this crowd, in deed and not in word, can fight against the police, all this is ABC. It is shameful to have to prove this, and only people who have forgotten everything and learned absolutely nothing could have decided the other way about. arriving at the fabulous, howling stupidity that the autocracy can be, quote, saved from the crowd by soldiers and from the revolutionary organizations by the police, but there is no salvation from individuals who hunt down ministers. This fabulous argument, which we are convinced is destined to become notorious, is by no means simply a curiosity. No, it's instructive, because, through a sweeping reduction to an absurdity, it reveals the principal mistake of the terrorists, which they share with the so-called economists, or perhaps one might already say, with the former representatives of deceased economism. Comment, this was a revisionist trend that Lenin combated at that time. Continuing. This mistake, as we have already pointed out on numerous occasions, consists in the failure to understand the basic defect of our movement. Because of the extremely rapid growth of the movement, the leaders lagged behind the masses. The revolutionary organizations did not come up to the level of the revolutionary activity of the proletariat, were incapable of marching on in front and leading the masses. That a discrepancy of this sort exists cannot be doubted by any conscientious person who has even the slightest acquaintance with the movement. And if that is so, it's evident that the present-day terrorists are really economists turned inside out, going to the equally foolish but opposite extreme. At a time when the revolutionaries are short of the forces and means to lead the masses, who are already rising, an appeal to resort to such terrorist acts as the organization of attempts on the lives of ministers by individuals and groups that are not known to one another means, not only thereby breaking off work among the masses, but also introducing downright disorganization into that work. We revolutionaries, quote, are accustomed to huddling together in timid knots, unquote, we read in the April 3rd leaflet. Quote, and even NB, the new, bold spirit that has appeared during the last 2 or 3 years, has so far done more to raise the sentiments of the crowd than of individuals, unquote. These words unintentionally express much that is true, and it is this very truth that deals a smashing rebuff to the propagandists of terrorism. From this truth, every thinking socialist draws the conclusion that it is necessary to use group action more energetically, boldly, and harmoniously. The socialist revolutionaries, however, conclude, shoot, elusive individual, for the knot of people, alas, is still a long way off, and besides, there are soldiers against the knot. This really defies all reason, gentlemen. Nor does the leaflet eschew the theory of excitative terrorism. Quote, each time a hero engages in single combat, this arouses in us all a spirit of struggle and courage, we're told. But we know from the past, and see in the present, that only new forms of the mass movement, or the awakening of new sections of the masses to independent struggle, really rouses a spirit of struggle and courage in all. Single combat, however, inasmuch as it remains single combat waged by the Balmashovs, has the immediate effect of simply creating a short-lived sensation, while indirectly it even leads to apathy and passive waiting for the next bout. We are further assured that, quote, every flash of terrorism lights up the mind, which unfortunately we have not noticed to be the case with the terrorism-preaching party of the socialist revolutionaries. We are presented with the theory of big work and petty work. Quote, let not those who have greater strength, greater opportunities, and resolution rest content with petty work. Let them find and devote themselves to a big cause, the propaganda of terrorism among the masses, the preparation of the intricate, and we see here how the theory of elusiveness is already forgotten, terrorist ventures, unquote. How amazingly clever this is, in all truth, to sacrifice the life of a revolutionary for the sake of wreaking vengeance on the scoundrel Sepyagin, who is then replaced by the scoundrel Plev. That is big work. But to prepare, for instance, the masses for an armed demonstration, that is petty work. This very point is explained in number 8 of Revolutionaria Russia, which declares that, quote, it is easy to write and speak of armed demonstrations, quote, as a matter of the vague and distant future, but up till now, all this talk has been merely of a theoretical nature, unquote. How well we know this language of people who are free of the constraint of firm socialist convictions, of the burdensome experience of each and every kind of popular movement. They confuse immediately tangible and sensational results with practicalness. To them, the demand to adhere steadfastly to the class standpoint and to maintain the mass nature of the movement is, quote, vague theorizing. In their eyes, definitiveness is slavish compliance with every turn of sentiment and, by reason of this compliance, inevitable helplessness at each turn. Demonstrations begin, and bloodthirsty words, talk about the beginning of the end, flow from the lips of such people. The demonstrations halt, their hands drop helplessly, and before they've had time to wear out a pair of boots, they're already shouting, "The people, alas, are still a long way off." Some new outrage is perpetrated by the Tsar's henchmen, and they demand to be shown a, quote, definite measure that would serve as an exhaustive reply to that particular outrage, a measure that would bring about an immediate, quote, transference of strength. And they proudly promise this transference. These people do not understand that this very promise to, quote, transfer strength constitutes political adventurism, and that their adventurism stems from their lack of principle. The Social Democrats, which is what they called Marxist at that time, will always warn against adventurism and ruthlessly expose illusions which inevitably end in complete disappointment. We must bear in mind that a revolutionary party is worthy of its name only when it leads, indeed, the movement of a revolutionary class. We must bear in mind that any popular movement assumes an infinite variety of forms, is constantly developing new forms and discarding the old, and effecting modifications or new combinations of old and new forms. It is our duty to participate actively in this process of working out means and methods of struggle. When the students' movement became sharper, we began to call on the workers to come to the aid of the students, without taking it upon ourselves to forecast the forms of the demonstrations, without promising that they would result in an immediate transference of strength, and lighting up the mind, or a special elusiveness. When the demonstrations became consolidated, we began to call for their organization and for the arming of the masses, and put forward the task of preparing a popular uprising. Without in the least denying violence and terrorism in principle, we demanded work for the preparation of such forms of violence as were calculated to bring about the direct participation of the masses and which guaranteed that participation. We do not close our eyes to the difficulties of this task, but will work at it steadfastly and persistently, undeterred by the objections that this is a matter of the, quote, vague and distant future. Yes, gentlemen, we stand for future and not only past forms of the movement. We give preference to long and arduous work on what promises a future, rather than to an easy repetition of what has been condemned by the past. We shall always expose people who, in word, war against hackneyed dogmas, and in practice, hold exclusively to such moth-eaten and harmful commonplaces as the theory of the transference of strength, the difference between big work and petty work, and of course, the theory of single combat. Quote, just as in the days of yore the people's battles were fought out by their leaders in single combat, so now the terrorists will win Russia's freedom in single combat with the autocracy, the April 3rd leaflet concludes. The mere reprinting of such sentences provides their refutation. Anyone who really carries on their revolutionary work in conjunction with the class struggle of the proletariat very well knows, sees, and feels what vast numbers of immediate and direct demands of the proletariat and of the sections of the people capable of supporting the latter remain unsatisfied. You know that in very many places, throughout vast areas, the working people are literally straining to go into action, and that their ardor runs to waste because of the scarcity of literature and leadership, the lack of forces and means in the revolutionary organizations. And we see that we find ourselves, in the same old vicious circle that has so long hemmed in the Russian Revolution like an omen of evil. On the one hand, the revolutionary ardor of the insufficiently enlightened and unorganized crowd runs to waste. On the other hand, shots fired by the elusive individuals who are losing faith in the possibility of marching in formation and working hand in hand with the masses also end in smoke. But things can still be put to rights, comrades. Loss of faith in a real cause is the rare exception rather than the rule. The urge to commit terrorist acts is a passing mood. Then let the Social Democrats close their ranks, and we shall fuse the militant organization of revolutionaries and the mass heroism of the Russian proletariat into a single whole. In the next article, we shall deal with the agrarian program of the Socialist Revolutionaries. Part 2. The Socialist Revolutionaries' attitude to the peasant movement is of particular interest. It is precisely in the agrarian question that representatives of the old Russian socialism, their liberal Narodnik descendants, and also adherents of opportunist criticism, who are so numerous in Russia and so vociferously pass assurances that, on this score, Marxism has already been conclusively disproved by the, quote, critics, have always considered themselves especially strong. Our socialist revolutionaries, too, are tearing Marxism to shreds, so to speak. Quote, dogmatic prejudices, outlived dogmas long since refuted by life. The revolutionary intelligentsia has shut its eyes to the countryside. Revolutionary work among the peasantry was forbidden by orthodoxy, unquote, and much else in this vein. It is the current fashion to kick out at orthodoxy. But to what subspecies must one relegate those of the kickers, who did not even manage to draw up an outline for an agrarian program of their own before the commencement of the peasant movement? When Iskra sketched its agrarian program as early as in number 3, Vestnik Ruskoi Revolucji could only mutter, given such a presentation of the question, still another of our differences is fading away. What happened here is that the editors of Vestnik Ruskoi Revolucji had the mishap of utterly failing to understand Iskra's presentation of the question, the introduction of the class struggle into the countryside. Revolutionaya Rossia now belatedly refers to the pamphlet entitled The Next Question, although it contains no program whatever, but only panegyrics on such celebrated opportunists as Hertz. And now these same people, who before the commencement of the movement were in agreement both with Iskra and with Hertz, come out on the day following the peasant uprising with a manifesto, quote, from the Peasant League of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, unquote. A manifesto in which you will not find a single syllable really emanating from the peasantry, but only a literal repetition of what you have read hundreds of times in the writings of the Narodniks, the liberals, and the, quote, critics. It is said that courage can move mountains. That is so, monsieur the socialist revolutionaries, but it is not to such courage that your garish advertisement testifies. We have seen that the socialist revolutionaries' greatest, quote, advantage lies in their freedom from theory. Their greatest skill consists in their ability to speak without saying anything. But in order to present a program, one must nevertheless say something. It is necessary, for instance, to throw overboard the, quote, dogma of the Russian Social Democrats of the late 80s and early 90s to the effect that there is no revolutionary force save the urban proletariat, unquote. What a handy little word dogma is. One need only slightly twist an opposing theory, cover up this twist with the boogeyman of dogma, and there you are. Beginning with the Communist Manifesto, all modern socialism rests on the indisputable truth that the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class in capitalist society. The other classes may and do become revolutionary only in part and only under certain conditions. What, then, must one think of people who have, quote, transformed this truth into a dogma of the Russian Social Democrats of a definite period, and who try to convince the naive reader that this dogma was, quote, based entirely on the belief that open political struggle lay far in the future, unquote. To counter Marx's doctrine that there is only one really revolutionary class in modern society, the socialist revolutionaries advanced the trinity of the intelligentsia, the proletariat, and the peasantry, thereby revealing a hopeless confusion of concepts. If one sets the intelligentsia against the proletariat and the peasantry, it means that one considers the former a definite social stratum, a group of persons occupying just as definite a social position as is occupied by the wage workers and the peasants. But as such a stratum, the Russian intelligentsia is precisely a bourgeois and petty bourgeois intelligentsia. With regard to this stratum, Mr. Struve is quite right in calling his paper the mouthpiece of the Russian intelligentsia. However, if one is referring to those intellectuals who have not yet taken any definite social stand, or have already been thrown off their normal stand by the facts of life, and are passing over to the side of the proletariat, then it is altogether absurd to contrapose this intelligentsia to the proletariat. Like any other class in modern society, the proletariat is not only advancing intellectuals from its own midst, but also accepts into its ranks supporters from the midst of all and sundry educated people. The campaign of the socialist revolutionaries against the basic, quote, dogma of Marxism is merely additional proof that the entire strength of this party is represented by the handful of Russian intellectuals who have broken away from the old but have not yet adhered to the new. The socialist revolutionaries' views on the peasantry are even more muddled. To take just the posing of this question, quote, what social classes, in general, always cling to the existing, by which do they mean the autocratic only, or bourgeois in general, order, guard it, and do not yield to revolutionization, unquote. As a matter of fact, this question can be answered only by another question. What elements of the intelligentsia in general always cling to the existing chaos of ideas, guard it, and do not yield to a definite socialist world outlook? But the socialist revolutionaries want to give a serious answer to an insignificant question. To these classes, they refer first the bourgeoisie, since its, quote, interests have been satisfied, unquote. This old prejudice that the interests of the Russian bourgeoisie have already been satisfied to such a degree that we neither have nor can have bourgeois democracy in our country is now shared by the economists and the socialist revolutionaries. Again, won't Mr. Struve teach them some common sense? Secondly, the The socialist revolutionaries include among these classes the, quote, petty bourgeois strata, quote, whose interests are individualistic, undefined as class interests, and do not lend themselves to formulation in a reformative or revolutionary socio-political program, unquote. Whence this has come, the Lord alone knows. It is common knowledge that the petty bourgeoisie does not always, and in general, guard the existing order, but on the contrary, often takes revolutionary action against even the bourgeoisie, specifically when it joins the proletariat, and very often against absolutism, and that it almost always formulates programs of social reform. Our author has simply come out with a noisier declaration against the petty bourgeoisie in accordance with the, quote, practical rule, which Turgenev expressed through an old fox in one of his poems in prose, quote, cry out most loudly against those vices you yourself feel guilty of. And so, since the socialist revolutionaries feel that the only social basis of their position between two stools can perhaps be provided only by certain petty bourgeois sections of the intelligentsia, they therefore write about the petty bourgeoisie as if this term does not signify a social category, but is simply a polemical turn of speech. They likewise want to evade the unpleasant fact of their failure to understand that the peasantry of today belongs as a whole to this, quote, petty bourgeois stratum. Won't you try to give us an answer on this score, Monsieur the Socialist Revolutionaries? Won't you tell us why it is that, while repeating snatches of the theory of Russian Marxism, for example about the progressive significance of peasant outside employment and tramping, you turn a blind eye to the fact that this same Marxism has revealed the petty bourgeois makeup of Russian peasant economy? Won't you explain to us how it is possible in contemporary society for, quote, proprietors or semi-proprietors not to belong to the petty bourgeois strata? No, harbor no hopes. The socialist revolutionaries will not reply. They will not say or explain anything bearing upon the matter, for they, again like the economists, have thoroughly learned the tactic of pleading ignorance when it comes to theory. Revolutionная Russia looks meaningly toward Vestnik Russkoye Revolucji. That is their job, they say, while Vestnik Russkoye Revolucji informs its readers of the exploits of the opportunist critics and keeps on threatening to make its criticism ever sharper. That is hardly enough, gentlemen. The socialist revolutionaries have kept themselves pure of the baneful influence of modern socialist doctrines. They have fully preserved the good old methods of vulgar socialism. We are confronted by a new historical fact, a new movement among a certain section of the people. They do not examine the condition of this section, or set themselves the aim of explaining its movement by the nature of that section and its relation to the developing economic structure of society as a whole. To them, all this is an empty dogma, outlived orthodoxy. They do things more simply. What is it that the representatives of the rising section themselves are speaking about? Land, additional allotments, redistribution of the land. There it is in a nutshell. You have a, quote, semi-socialist program, a, quote, thoroughly correct principle, a, quote, bright idea, a, quote, ideal which already lives in the peasant's mind in the embryo form, etc. All that is necessary is to, quote, brush up and elaborate this ideal, bring out the, quote, pure idea of socialism. You find this hard to believe, reader? It seems incredible to you that this neurotic junk should again be dragged into the light of day by people who so glibly repeat whatever the latest book might tell them. And yet this is a fact, and all the words we have quoted are in the declaration, quote, from the Peasant League, published in number 8 of Revolutionная Russia. The socialist revolutionaries accuse Iskra of having prematurely tolled the knell of the peasant movement by describing it as the last peasant revolt. The peasantry, they inform us, can participate in the socialist movement of the proletariat as well. This accusation testifies to the confusion of thought among the socialist revolutionaries. They have not even grasped that the democratic movement against the remnants of serf ownership is one thing, and the socialist movement against the bourgeoisie is quite another. Since they have failed to understand the peasant movement itself, they have likewise been unable to understand that the words in Iskra which frighten them so refer only to the former movement. Not only has Iskra stated in its program that the small producers, including the peasants, who are being ruined, can and should participate in the socialist movement of the proletariat, but it has also defined the exact conditions for this participation. The peasant movement of today, however, is not at all a socialist movement directed against the bourgeoisie and capitalism. On the contrary, it unites the bourgeois and the proletarian elements in the peasantry, which are really one in the struggle against the remnants of the serf-owning system. The peasant movement of today is leading, and will lead, to the establishment not of a socialist or a semi-socialist way of life in the countryside, but of a bourgeois way of life, and will clear away the feudal debris cluttering up the bourgeois foundations that have already arisen in our countryside. But all this is a sealed book to the socialist revolutionaries. They even assure Iskra in all seriousness that to clear the way for the development of capitalism is an empty dogma, since the, quote, reforms of the 1860s, quote, did clear full space for the development of capitalism, unquote. Comment, so the 1860s was sort of the official end of feudalism in Russia, but not really. A lot of that system did persist. However, there were major changes which were sort of the official beginning of the end, if you will. As Lenin asserts here, there was definitely still more work to be done. Continuing, this is what can be written by a glib person who lets a facile pen run away with him and who imagines that the peasant league can get away with anything. The peasant, in other words, won't see through it. But kindly reflect for a moment, my dear author. Have you never heard that remnants of the serf-owning system retard the development of capitalism? Don't you think that this is even all but tautological? And haven't you read somewhere about the remnants of serf ownership in the present-day Russian countryside? Iskra says that the impending revolution will be a bourgeois revolution. The socialist revolutionaries object. It will be, quote, primarily a political revolution and to a certain extent a democratic revolution, unquote. Won't the authors of this pretty objection try to explain this to us? Does history know of any bourgeois revolution, or is such a bourgeois revolution conceivable that is not, quote, to a certain extent a democratic revolution? Why, even the program of the socialist revolutionaries themselves, egalitarian tenure of land that has become social property, does not go beyond the limits of a bourgeois program, since the preservation of commodity production and toleration of private farming, even if it is conducted on common land, in no way eliminates capitalist relations in agriculture. The greater the levity with which the socialist revolutionaries approach the most elementary truths of modern socialism, the more easily do they invent most elementary deductions, even taking pride in the fact that their, quote, program reduces itself to such. Let us then examine all three of their deductions, which most probably will long remain a monument to the keen wit and profound socialist convictions of the socialist revolutionaries. Deduction number 1, quote, a large portion of the territory of Russia now already belongs to the state. What we need is that all the territory should belong to the people, unquote. Our teeth are, quote, now already on edge from the touching references to state ownership of land in Russia contained in the writings of the police Narodniks, a la Sazonov, etc., and the various Katedra reformers. What we need is that people who style themselves socialists and even revolutionaries should trail in the rear of these gentlemen. What we need is that socialists should lay stress on the alleged omnipotence of the state, forgetting even that a large share of the state land is concentrated in the uninhabited marginal regions of the country, and not on the class antagonism between the semi-serf peasantry and the privileged handful of big landowners, who own most of the best cultivated land, and with whom the state has always been on the best of terms. Our socialist revolutionaries, who imagine that they are deducing a pure idea of socialism, are in actual fact sullying this idea by their uncritical attitude toward the old narratism. Deduction number 2, quote, the land is now already passing from capital to labor, okay? What we need is that this process be completed by the state, unquote. The deeper you go into the forest, the thicker the trees. Let us take another step towards police narratism. Let us call on the class, quote, state to extend peasant land ownership in general. This is remarkably socialistic and amazingly revolutionary. But what can one expect of people who call the purchase and lease of land by the peasants a transfer, quote, from capital to labor, and not transfer of land from the feudal-minded landlords to the rural bourgeoisie? Let us remind these people at least of the statistics on the actual distribution of the land that is, quote, passing to labor. Between 6 and 9/10 of all peasant-purchased land, and from 5 to 8/10 of all leased land, are concentrated in the hands of 1/5 of the peasant households, i.e., in the hands of a small minority of well-to-do peasants. From this, one can judge whether there is much truth in the socialist revolutionaries' words when they assert that, quote, we do not at all count on the well-to-do peasants, but only on the, quote, laboring sections exclusively. Deduction number 3, quote, the peasant already has land, and in most cases on the basis of egalitarian land distribution, what we need is that this labor tenure should be carried through to the end, and culminate in collective agricultural production through the development of cooperatives of every kind, unquote. Scratch a socialist revolutionary, and you find Mr. VV. When it came to action, all the old prejudices of narratism, which had safely preserved themselves behind shifty phrasing, crept to the surface at once. state ownership of the land, the completion by the state of the transference of the land to the peasantry, the village commune, cooperatives, collectivism. In this magnificent scheme of M. Sazonov, Yuzov, N., and on, the socialist revolutionaries, Hofstadter, Toto Miance, and so on and so forth. In this scheme, a mere trifle is lacking. It takes account neither of developing capitalism nor of the class struggle. But then how could this trifle enter the minds of people whose entire ideological luggage consists of neurotic rags and smart patches of fashionable criticism? Did not Mr. Bulgakov himself say that there is no place for the class struggle in the countryside? Will the replacement of the class struggle by, quote, cooperatives of every kind fail to satisfy both the liberals and the critics, and in general all those to whom socialism is no more than a traditional label? And is it not possible to try to soothe naive people with the assurance, of course, any idealization of the village commune is alien to us? Although right next to this assurance you read some colossal bombast about the, quote, colossal organization of the mere peasants. Then bombast that, quote, in certain respects no other class in Russia is so impelled toward a purely political struggle as the peasantry, that peasant self-determination is far broader in scope and in competence than that of the Zemstvo, that this combination of, quote, broad, up to the very boundary of the village, quote, independent activity, with an absence of the, quote, most elementary civic rights, quote, seems to have been deliberately designed for the purpose of rousing and exercising political instincts and habits of social struggle, unquote. If you don't like all this, you don't have to listen, but, quote, one has to be blind not to see how much easier it is to pass to the idea of socializing the land from the traditions of communal land tenure, unquote. Is it not the other way around, gentlemen? Are not those people hopelessly deaf and blind, who to this very day do not know that it is precisely the medieval seclusion of the semi-serf commune, which splits the peasantry into tiny unions and binds the rural proletariat hand and foot, that maintains the traditions of stagnation, oppression, and barbarism? Are you not defeating your own purpose by recognizing the usefulness of outside employment, which has already destroyed by 3/4 the much vaunted traditions of egalitarian land tenure in the commune, and has reduced these traditions to meddling by the police? The minimum program of the socialist revolutionaries, based as it is on the theory we have just analyzed, is a real curiosity. This, quote, program includes 2 items. 1, quote, socialization of the land, i.e. its conversion into the property of the whole of society to be used by the working people, unquote. 2, quote, the development among the peasantry of all possible types of public associations and economic cooperatives. Lenin questions for a, quote, purely political struggle, question mark. Continuing, for the gradual emancipation of the peasantry from the sway of money capital, Lenin adds, and subjugation to industrial, and for the preparation of collective agricultural production of the future, unquote. Just as the sun is reflected in a drop of water, so is the entire spirit of the present-day social revolutionarism reflected in these 2 items. In theory, revolutionary phrasemongering instead of a considered and integral system of views. In practice, helpless snatching at this or that modish, petty expedient instead of participation in the class struggle. That is all they have to show. We must admit that it has required rare civic courage to place socialization of the land alongside of cooperation in a minimum program. Their minimum program, Babeuf on the one hand and Mr. Levitsky on the other. This is inimitable. If it were possible to take this program seriously, we should have to say that in deceiving themselves with grandiloquent words, the socialist revolutionaries are also deceiving the peasants. It is deception to assert that, quote, cooperatives of every kind play a revolutionary role in present-day society and prepare the way for collectivism rather than strengthening the rural bourgeoisie. It is deception to assert that socialization of the land can be placed before the peasantry as a, quote, minimum, as something just as close at hand as the establishment of cooperatives. Any socialist could explain to our socialist revolutionaries that today the abolition of private ownership of land can only be the immediate prelude to its abolition in general, that the mere transfer of the land, quote, to be used by the working people would still not satisfy the proletariat, since millions and tens of millions of ruined peasants are no longer able to work the land even if they had it, and to supply these ruined millions with implements, cattle, etc. would amount to the socialization of all the means of production. It would require a socialist revolution of the proletariat and not a peasant movement against the remnants of the serf-owning system. The socialist revolutionaries are confusing socialization of the land with bourgeois nationalization of the land. Speaking in the abstract, the latter is conceivable on the basis of capitalism too, without abolishing wage labor. But the very example of these same socialist revolutionaries is vivid confirmation of the truth that to advance the demand for nationalization of the land in a police state is tantamount to obscuring the only revolutionary principle, that of the class struggle, and bringing grist to the mill of every kind of bureaucracy. Not only that, the socialist revolutionaries descend to outright reaction when they rise up against the demand of our draft program for the, quote, annulment of all laws restricting the peasant in the free disposal of their land, unquote. For the sake of the Narodnik prejudice about the commune principle and the egalitarian principle, they deny to the peasant such a most elementary civic right as the right freely to dispose of their land. They complacently shut their eyes to the fact that the village commune of today is hemmed in by its socialist state reality. They become champions of the police interdictions established and supported by the state of the rural superintendents. We believe that not only Mr. Levitsky, but Mr. Pobedonostov too, will not be very much alarmed over the demand for socialization of the land for the purpose of establishing egalitarian land tenure, once this demand is put forth as a minimum demand alongside of which such things figure as cooperatives and the defense of the police system of keeping the mujik tied down to the official allotment which supports him. Let the agrarian program of the socialist revolutionaries serve as a lesson and a warning to all socialists, a glaring example of what results from an absence of ideology and principles, which some unthinking people call freedom from dogma. When it came to action, the socialist revolutionaries did not reveal even a single of the three conditions essential for the elaboration of a consistent socialist program. 1. A clear idea of the ultimate aim. 2. A correct understanding of the path leading to that aim. And 3. An accurate conception of the true state of affairs at the given moment or of the immediate tasks of that moment. They simply obscured the ultimate aim of socialism by confusing socialization of the land with bourgeois nationalization, and by confusing the primitive peasant idea about small-scale egalitarian land tenure with the doctrine of modern socialism on the conversion of all means of production into public property and the organization of socialist production. Their conception of the path leading to socialism is peerlessly characterized by their substitution of the development of cooperatives for the class struggle. In their estimation of the present stage in the agrarian evolution of Russia, they have forgotten a trifle, the remnants of serf ownership, which weigh so heavily on our countryside. The famous trinity which reflects their theoretical views, the intelligentsia, the proletariat, and the peasantry, has its complement in the no less famous three-point, quote, program, socialization of the land, cooperatives, and attachment to the allotment. Compare this with Iskra's program, which indicates to the entire militant proletariat one ultimate aim, without reducing it to a minimum, without debasing it so as to adapt it to the ideas of certain backward sections of the proletariat or of the small producers. The road leading to this aim is the same in town and countryside, the class struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. But besides this class struggle, another struggle is going on in our countryside, the struggle of the entire peasantry against the remnants of serf ownership. And in this struggle, the party of the proletariat promises its support to the entire peasantry and strives to provide its revolutionary ardor with a real objective and guide its uprising against its real enemy, considering it dishonest and unworthy to treat the mujik as if he were under tutelage or to conceal from him the fact that at present and immediately he can achieve only the complete eradication of all traces and remnants of the serf-owning system, and only clear the way for the broader and more difficult struggle of the entire proletariat against the whole of bourgeois society. And that is the end of the audiobook. What do you think? Leave a question or comment in the comments area below. We'll continue the discussion there as always. I don't have a lot of extra comments for now. I can anticipate some questions coming up, so I think I'd rather reserve my energy for specific questions that people have. So, with that, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen and help this channel to keep growing, and specifically to help me to commit more time to this channel, which is non-commercial, no ads, no sponsorships, and viewer-supported, then become a supporting viewer. Head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. We do have a healthy amount of support now, and I am happy for the time being with the amount of content that we're able to develop. However, I do have other avenues that I would like to develop on the channel. However, the level of support does kind of need to reach a higher average before I'm able to commit to that. So these are more medium and long-term goals. I'm sure we will get there. Thanks to everyone who has supported over the last 4 years. Again, patreon.com/socialismforall and buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's thanks or good video. All of that helps to boost this content and this channel in the algorithm, whether it's on YouTube, Patreon, Spotify, SoundCloud, Substack, and wherever else this is being posted in the future. We have seen a lot of growth. That's great to see. Almost 20,000 subscribers as of January 2024, and love to see that number keep climbing and continuing to expand this discussion. Finally, agitation and education can be done online, but the third and also extremely important element of that formula, organizing, needs to be done in person, in your community. If you're in a city, there are probably left groups that you can connect with, see what kind of work is being done, see who you can network with. If you're in a more rural area, you may have to connect with something on more of a statewide or regional basis, but this can be done also. All right, thanks again. We will see you in the next video coming soon.